The world was still mostly wild when Abraham Lincoln was born. It was a cold winter morning, February 12, 1809, in a small one-room log cabin nestled deep in the wooded hills of Kentucky. There were no city streets, no stone mansions, no polished boots or velvet curtains, just trees, wind, earth. The Lincoln family was not wealthy. His father, Thomas Lincoln, worked with his hands, farming, chopping wood, building fences. His mother, Nancy, was gentle and quiet, with deep-set eyes and a calm way of holding her child. Even when the fire burned low, Abraham was born into silence. Not the kind you fear, the kind that settles in around you like a soft blanket. The cabin was small, barely larger than a bedroom today. The wind slipped between the cracks in the logs. Chickens rustled outside, and within a baby boy, long-limbed and strong-voiced, cried out his first hello to the world. He would come to be known as many things: president, liberator, martyr. But back then, he was just Abe. A tall, quiet boy with serious eyes and a thoughtful way of listening. He grew up not in privilege but in movement. The Lincolns moved often, first to Indiana, then later to Illinois. The frontier was hard. The land was rugged. Schools were scarce and books even scarcer. But when young Abraham found one, he clung to it like treasure. He read slowly, with care. He read by firelight, by candlelight, even by the fading twilight. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, he read the Bible, Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, Shakespeare later. But above all, he learned to love words, not just reading them, understanding them, the shape of them, the weight they carried, how they could build things inside the mind that couldn't yet be seen outside. He had little formal education, maybe a year in total. But education was not only in classrooms, it was in the woods, in the fields, in watching people, in listening to stories, in noticing how the world worked around him. His mother, Nancy, died when he was just 9 years old. He remembered her forever after. He once said, "All that I am or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." Her absence left a silence that even books couldn't fill. But his father remarried, a woman named Sarah who was kind to Abe and treated him like her own. She encouraged him to read, to grow, to ask questions, and so he did. He grew tall, very tall, taller than most boys, taller than most men. He stood out even when he tried not to, but he didn't speak often. When he did, it was with purpose. People listened. They say he could split logs in a single swing, that he worked long hours clearing fields, planting crops, hauling water. But when the work was done, he returned to books, to thoughts, to stillness. He once walked miles just to borrow a single volume, and when he returned it, he remembered more than what it said. He remembered what it meant. In time, he became known for his storytelling, funny, sharp, thoughtful. People gathered around him, drawn not to his power, he had none yet, but to his presence. He had a way of making people feel heard, even when he spoke very little. In his 20s, he left home and struck out on his own. He worked odd jobs: store clerk, surveyor, postmaster, anything that paid. He listened. He watched. He observed the small injustices of daily life, the way power could be used to hurt, the way rules bent toward the rich, the way fairness was often left behind in favor of speed. He noticed how slavery shaped everything. Even in places it wasn't, allowed, its shadow loomed. He hated it. Not just because it was cruel, but because it broke something inside a person who allowed it. It stole not just freedom, but dignity. And though he didn't know it yet, Abe Lincoln was beginning the slow journey toward something bigger. Not politics, not speeches, not fame, but purpose. He would one day stand in front of crowds and speak of liberty, of equality, of government by the people. But for now, he was a young man, alone in a rented room, reading by candlelight, falling asleep beside the worn edges of a borrowed book, not knowing that history was already watching, that destiny was already listening, that the tall, quiet boy from Kentucky would one day be the voice of a fractured nation. But tonight he just turned the last page, blew out the candle, and let the quiet of the frontier hold him. By the time Abraham Lincoln settled in the small town of New Salem, Illinois, he was still a man without a title, No land, no wealth, no formal education. But already something about him felt steady. He worked odd jobs, carried mail, split rails, measured land with ropes and surveyor's chains. His hands were rough, his boots worn, but his mind sharp, always turning. People noticed, not because he demanded attention, he never did, but because he listened differently than most men. He looked at you when you spoke. He let silence sit between your words like he was digging for what you hadn't said yet. And in that little town of New Salem, Abraham Lincoln found his voice. He told stories that made people laugh, simple, honest tales from the road or from memory, always with a twist of wit and a seed of meaning underneath. They called him Honest Abe. At first it was a nickname. Later it became something more. He read every law book he could find, studied by candlelight again, just as he had as a boy. But now the stakes felt higher. Now the world was bigger, more complicated. There were contracts to understand, property lines to defend, and people who needed someone to stand up for them, so he studied law. And soon, he practiced it. Self-taught, self-made. He passed the bar exam in 1836 and began his career as a lawyer. But he was never the kind who only spoke in court. He traveled on horseback by wagon, riding the circuit across Illinois, visiting small towns and handling whatever cases came, land disputes, debts, criminal defense, and wherever he went. People listened. He had a way of simplifying things, of explaining the law like it was a story you'd already heard once before but forgotten. He didn't use big words to impress. He used clear ones to connect. By now, Lincoln had grown into a tall, lanky figure, broad-shouldered, long-legged, often wearing clothes that hung loosely on him like borrowed fabric. He never looked like a politician, and maybe that's why people trusted him. He ran for state legislature and won, then again, and again. And in 1846, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. It was his first taste of national politics. And yet, he never seemed completely at home in Washington. He was too grounded, too plain-spoken. He didn't chase spotlight or ceremony, but he did speak against something that others feared to touch: slavery. He believed it was wrong. Not just morally, but deeply, fundamentally wrong for a nation that called itself free. Still, he was cautious, measured. He didn't shout, he reasoned. He believed in the power of the Constitution, of words that bound people not by force, but by agreement. After his term in Congress, he returned to Illinois, back to his small law practice, back to the simplicity he understood. He might have remained there forever, another thoughtful country lawyer, but the nation was changing. Slavery wasn't just a Southern issue anymore. It was seeping into every conversation, every election, every corner of the map. And then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, a law that allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. To Lincoln, this was dangerous. Not just because it expanded slavery, but because it undermined the moral center of the country. And so he returned to politics, not with shouting, with speeches carefully worded, slowly delivered, and always carried by quiet conviction. People came to listen, and in 1858, during a U.S. Senate campaign, Abraham Lincoln stepped into the national spotlight with his series of debates against Stephen Douglas. They stood in open fields, on makeshift platforms. Before crowds that leaned forward listening hard, Douglas was loud, polished, a practiced speaker. Lincoln paused, spoke plainly, let his thoughts breathe. And in one of those debates, he said a sentence that would echo, "For generations, a house divided against itself cannot stand." It was not meant as poetry. It was a warning. The nation, Lincoln believed, could not survive half slave and half free. He lost the Senate race, but he won something else, the ear of the nation. Suddenly, newspapers printed his name. Citizens quoted his words. Even those who disagreed respected his reasoning, and quietly, far from the grandeur of Washington, a movement began to build around him. He did not chase the presidency, but by 1860, the country chased him. They wanted a man who understood the law, who believed in the Union, who had never owned another human being, who still carried the weight of the frontier in his walk. And that year, Abraham Lincoln was nominated for president. In a nation already on the edge, his name would soon become more than just respected. It would become a test. But for now, he sat in a quiet room in Springfield, Illinois, hands folded, eyes distant, and outside as the first snows fell. The country held its breath. Autumn passed quietly in Springfield. The air was cool. Leaves fell gently from the trees that lined the wide streets. Abraham Lincoln sat by the window, reading letters by lamplight, each one written in a different hand, each one asking a version of the same question. Will you save us? He had not asked for this. He had not dreamed of power. Not when he was a barefoot boy in Kentucky. Not when he was reading books by candlelight. Not even when he stood in debates that drew thousands. But now the choice had arrived, and across the nation, people were listening. The presidential election of 1860 was not just a race. It was a reckoning. Lincoln ran as the candidate of the Republican Party, a new party formed around opposition to the spread of slavery. He believed in compromise where possible, in unity where achievable, but not in silence when faced with wrong. His words were careful, his tone calm, but his presence felt like change, not revolution, not rebellion. Something quieter, like the steady creak of wood as a door slowly opens. The nation watched, and in November the results arrived. Abraham Lincoln had won, not with threats, not with violence, but with votes. He became the 16th president of the United States, but his victory didn't bring celebration everywhere. In the South, fear turned to fury. Many believed Lincoln's election meant the end of their way of life. Not because he had promised to abolish slavery outright, he had not, but because he refused to let it expand. And for some, that was enough. By the time Lincoln even arrived in Washington, 7 southern states had seceded. They had broken away, declared independence, formed a new government, a new country, the Confederate States of America. Before Lincoln ever sat behind the president's desk, the country he was elected to lead had already split. He arrived in Washington under cover, quietly, at night. There were rumors of plots to kill him before he could take office. No cheering crowds greeted him, just tight security, nervous glances, a sense of something fragile beginning to crack. But still, he stood on the steps of the Capitol that March, tall, solemn, weathered, and he delivered his first inaugural address. He spoke not in triumph, but in appeal. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. His voice didn't tremble, but it didn't shout either. It was calm, like a hand reaching. Out in the dark, he didn't threaten the South. He asked them to stay, to wait, to think, to remember what they once shared. But it was too late. 1 month later, in April 1861, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter, a U.S. military base in South Carolina. The war had begun, and the man who had once walked barefoot through Indiana fields now led a nation at war with itself. He did not celebrate, he mourned. The dream of unity, the great American experiment, was now a battlefield. But even as the first cannons fired, Lincoln did not give up on the idea that the Union could be saved. Believed in a government of the people. He believed that all men were created equal. He believed that words still had power. He carried no sword, only his pen, and for the rest of his presidency he would write letters, orders, speeches, each one trying in its own quiet way to pull a nation back from the edge. But in those early days, as soldiers gathered and families wept and maps were redrawn in red and blue, Lincoln did not yet know that the cost would be greater than anyone imagined and that his own life would be part of the price. But for now, in the quiet hours of that first spring as president, he stood at the window of the White House, hands folded behind his back, and in the distance he listened to cannons, to conflict, to the sound of a country beginning to fracture. But he did not step back. He only whispered, "We must hold." The war did not arrive all at once. It came in ripples like thunder in the distance, and then suddenly, it was everywhere. The maps changed. Lines drawn not in ink but in blood. The Union in the north, the Confederacy in the south, and in between, farms, towns, rivers, families. Divided, Abraham Lincoln watched it all from the stillness of the White House. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't ride to battle, but every death, every telegram, every headline landed on his shoulders, and those shoulders began to droop. They say the war aged him, that his face, once lined only by thought, became carved by sorrow, that his eyes, deep-set and grey, carried the weight of every fallen soldier. But he did not falter, not when the Union lost its early battles, not when critics shouted from all sides, not when even his own cabinet doubted him. He listened, he reflected. And then he acted slowly, carefully but always with purpose. In 1862 he issued a warning to the southern states: return to the Union, or slavery would be ended. The South did not return. So on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all enslaved people, only those in rebellious states, but it changed the purpose of the war. Now, the Union didn't just fight to preserve the country. It fought to end slavery, and Lincoln, the boy from the log cabin, the man who once borrowed books by firelight, became the great emancipator. He knew the decision was risky. It could cost him political support. It could prolong the war. But he believed, simply and fully, that it was right. And sometimes, that was enough. The war raged on: Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, Chickamauga. Names that echoed through homes, through letters, through whispered prayers at night. In the middle of it all, Lincoln would visit the wounded. He walked among them in army, tents pausing at each bedside. He held hands, he listened to names, he remembered faces. He wrote letters to mothers who had lost sons, not as a politician, as a father, as a man who knew grief. And through it all he wrote speeches, none longer than the one he gave at Gettysburg. Just a few months after one of the bloodiest battles in American history, he stood at a simple podium, surrounded by tombstones. He spoke for less than 3 minutes, but in those few breaths he gave the country one of its most sacred messages: that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture wildly. He just spoke. And in that stillness, something changed. The war would continue. Thousands more would fall. But now the reason was clearer. It was no longer just about land or law. It was about a promise that freedom belonged to all, that the Union was not just geography, it was principle. And Lincoln held that principle like a candle in a storm, shaking, but never extinguished. He faced re-election in 1864. Many thought he would lose. The war had dragged on. The toll was high. But as Union victories slowly returned, hope returned with them. And when the votes were counted, Lincoln had won. A second chance to bring peace, but he knew the end of war would not be the end of struggle. Healing a wounded nation would be its own kind of battle, and still, he prepared for it. He began to speak not of enemies, but of reunion, not of punishment, but of mercy. He planned to rebuild the nation with open hands, not clenched fists, but the war had taken something from him. He laughed less. He slept little. He carried too many names in his mind. Still, when he walked the halls of the White House, he often stopped to watch the sunrise and whispered words that no one ever wrote down. But maybe they sounded like, "We are not there yet, but we are closer." By early 1865, the war was drawing to a close. You could feel it in the air. The gunfire was still real, the losses were still heavy, but something was shifting. The Confederacy was weakening, its armies retreating, its hope fading. And in Washington, President Lincoln stood taller again, not because the burden was lighter, but because the end of the burden was in sight. On March 4th, 1865, he stepped once more onto the platform at the Capitol to deliver his second inaugural address. The sky was overcast, the crowd quiet. Lincoln did not speak of victory, he spoke of forgiveness. of the deep wounds that needed healing, of malice toward none, and charity for all. His voice was softer than 4 years before. He was not a candidate now. He was a witness. He had seen what hatred cost. He had counted its toll, and all he wanted now was peace. But peace is never simple, not even for a man who had given his life to it. On April 9, 1865, the Confederate Army surrendered. The war was over. 4 years of bloodshed, 600,000 lives, countless homes shattered, and now, silence. Celebration filled the streets. People sang, danced, embraced one another in the squares of cities across the North. But Lincoln, he stayed calm. He walked the streets of Richmond, the Confederate capital, days after its fall, not as a conqueror, but as a man in thought. Newspapers called him a hero. People cried when they saw him. Freed men and women knelt before him, but he gently told them to rise. "Don't kneel to me," he said. "Kneel only to God." In his heart he had begun to imagine a future, a reunited country, a kinder country, a nation finally, living up to its promise. He told stories again at night, laughed a little more, even took a carriage ride with his wife Mary. One morning, smiling as he watched the trees sway in the spring wind, she later said he was never so happy. And maybe he was. He had seen the country survive its greatest test. He had led not by anger but by endurance. But just 5 days after the war ended, on April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln went to the theater. It was Good Friday. The play was light-hearted. The mood relaxed. He sat beside his wife in the presidential box at Ford's Theater, watching the stage, hands clasped gently in his lap, and then a man slipped into the shadows behind him. A gunshot cracked through the air. The laughter stopped. The actors froze, and just like that, the candle blew out. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He was carried across the street, into a boarding house, and laid upon a simple bed. Doctors gathered. Prayers whispered. Time slowed, and in the still grey morning of April 15th, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, took his final breath. The war was over. But now, the man who had carried its weight was gone. News traveled quickly. Bells rang in mourning. Crowds gathered in silence. Flags were lowered. Even those who had once opposed him wept. The boy who had grown up with nothing, the man who had walked through war, heartbreak, and history, now rested in stillness. His body was placed in a long funeral train, moving slowly from Washington to Springfield. Thousands stood by the tracks. Some held candles, others held their children, and as the train passed, people wept. But not just for the loss, for what he stood for. Because Abraham Lincoln wasn't just a president, he was a promise. That kindness could live alongside power, that humility could sit beneath a crown, that a quiet man from the woods could change the course of a nation. They buried him beneath a marble tomb in Illinois, in the place where he had once read books by candlelight, and above it they placed his words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." He never saw the future he dreamed of, but because of him, it was possible. And even now, when you walk through those woods or pass by old fields under soft light, or hear the slow rhythm of a train at night, you might still feel it, that calm presence, that quiet strength, the tall man with the thoughtful eyes, still listening, still guiding, still remembered, before the motorcades, before the speeches that echoed across a nation, before the tragedy remembered by generations. He was before the motorcades, before the speeches that echoed across a nation, before the tragedy remembered by generations. He was just Jack, born on May 29, 1917, in a large white house on a quiet street in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the second child in a family that would one day be called American royalty. The Kennedys were wealthy, powerful, political. But Jack, he was different. He was sickly as a boy, thin, often pale. His back hurt, his stomach turned. His body even then seemed to resist him. But his eyes were bright, sharp, curious, always watching. He was a boy who loved to read, history, adventure, War, books that took him far from his sickbed and into worlds where courage could be found not in muscles but in mind. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was a man of ambition, a businessman, a politician, a voice that filled every room. He expected greatness from his children, especially from his oldest son, Joe Jr. Jack was the second son, the one people worried about. But he listened, he learned, and quietly he took it all in. He went to private schools, always a little behind in health but never in spirit. He joked often. He smiled easily. He charmed without trying. And even when illness kept him down, he came back, again and again. At Harvard, he studied history and government. And though his father's shadow loomed long, Jack slowly stepped out of it. He wrote papers that challenged assumptions. He debated with professors. He thought about war, about why nations rose and fell. And even then, even quietly. He dreamed of leadership. But then came World War II. Joe Jr. enlisted first. The Golden Sun. Jack followed. Despite his fragile health, he joined the Navy, and in the South Pacific, aboard a small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, Jack Kennedy faced the first great trial of his life. His boat was struck by a Japanese destroyer in the middle of the night. The explosion split the vessel in half. Sailors were thrown into the sea. Darkness swallowed everything. But Jack, injured, bleeding, exhausted, swam for hours, towing a wounded crewman by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth. They swam to an island, then another, surviving on rainwater and coconuts. He led them, not because he was the strongest, but because he refused to give up. When they were finally rescued, the story reached back home. For the first time, John F. Kennedy was known not just as Joe's brother, but as a hero in his own right. Still, war has its shadows. Jack returned with pain in his back that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And not long after, Joe Jr. was killed in a mission over Europe. The Golden Sun, gone. The future of the Kennedy legacy had to shift. Now Pommet turned to Jack. He did not leap toward politics, but the path came for him all the same. He ran for Congress in 1946, young, handsome, soft-spoken. People were drawn to him, not just for his name, but for his grace. He listened, he smiled, and he won. Washington noticed. This wasn't the loud, boastful kind of politician. This was something quieter, sharper, warmer. A man who understood pain but didn't show it. A man who knew loss but still believed in hope. At night, after the speeches were done, he would return to his study. Read, write, think. He published a book, Profiles in Courage, about U.S. senators who stood up for principle even when it cost them dearly. And in those pages, a quiet truth appeared. Jack Kennedy didn't just want to serve. He wanted to inspire. He wanted Americans to believe in the best version of themselves. And though his body still ached, though doctors warned him often that he was not strong, he kept going. He ran for Senate in 1952, and again. He won. By now, the country had begun to fall in love with him, his charm, his youth, his wife, Jacqueline, poised and elegant. Together they looked like the future. But even as crowds grew, as cameras flashed, Jack remained soft-spoken, deliberate, measured. He knew that every step forward brought more weight, more expectation, and deep down, he began to feel it. The presidency. He didn't say it. Not yet. But the idea lived in him, like a quiet flame, waiting before the motorcades, before the speeches that echoed across a nation, before the tragedy remembered by generations. He was just Jack. Born on May 29, 1917, in a large white house on a quiet street in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the second child in a family that would one day be called American royalty. The Kennedys were wealthy, powerful, political, but Jack, he was different. He was sickly as a boy, thin, often pale. His back hurt. His stomach turned. His body even then seemed to resist him, but his eyes were bright, sharp, curious, always watching. He was a boy who loved to read, history, adventure, war. Books that took him far from his sickbed and into worlds where courage could be found not in muscles but in mind. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was a man of ambition, a businessman, a politician, a voice that filled every room. He expected greatness from his children, especially from his oldest son. Joe Jr. Jack was the second son, the one people worried about. But he listened, he learned, and quietly, he took it all in. He went to private schools, always a little behind in health but never in spirit. He joked often, he smiled easily, he charmed without trying, and even when illness kept him down, he came back again and again. At Harvard, he studied history and government, and though his father's shadow loomed long, Jack slowly stepped out of it. He wrote papers that challenged assumptions. He debated with professors. He thought about war, about why nations rose and fell. And even then, even quietly, he dreamed of leadership. But then came World War II. Joe Jr. enlisted first. The Golden Sun. Jack followed. Despite his fragile health, he joined the Navy, and in the South Pacific, aboard a small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, Jack Kennedy faced the first great trial of his life. His boat was struck by a Japanese destroyer in the middle of the night. The explosion split the vessel in half. Sailors were thrown into the sea. Darkness swallowed everything. But Jack, injured, bleeding, exhausted, swam for hours, towing a wounded crewman by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth. They swam to an island, then another. Surviving on rainwater and coconuts, he led them, not because he was the strongest, but because he refused to give up. When they were finally rescued, the story reached back home. For the first time, John F. Kennedy was known not just as Joe's brother, but as a hero in his own right. Still, war has its shadows. Jack returned with pain in his back that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And not long after, Joe Jr. was killed in a mission over Europe. The Golden Sun, gone. The future of the Kennedy legacy had to shift. Now, it turned to Jack. He did not leap toward politics, but the path came for him all the same. He ran for Congress in 1946, young, handsome, soft-spoken. People were drawn to him, not just for his name, but for his grace. He listened, he smiled, and he won, Washington noticed. This wasn't the loud, boastful kind of politician. This was something quieter, sharper, warmer, a man who understood pain but didn't show it. A man who knew loss but still believed in hope. At night, after the speeches were done, he would return to his study. Read, write, think. He published a book, Profiles in Courage, about U.S. senators who stood up for principle even when it cost them dearly. And in those pages, a quiet truth appeared. Jack Kennedy didn't just want to serve, he wanted to inspire. He wanted Americans to believe in the best version of themselves, and though his body still ached, though doctors warned him often that he was not strong, he kept going. He ran for Senate in 1952, and again, he won. By now, the country had begun to fall in love with him, his charm, his youth, his wife, Jacqueline, poised and elegant. Together, they looked like the future. But even as crowds grew, as cameras flashed, Jack remained soft-spoken, deliberate, measured. He knew that every step forward brought more weight, more expectation, and deep down, he began to feel it. The presidency. He didn't say it. Not yet. But the idea lived in him, like a quiet flame, waiting before the motorcades, before the speeches that echoed across a nation, before the tragedy remembered by generations. He was just Jack. Born on May 29, 1917, in a large white house on a quiet street in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the second child in a family that would one day be called American royalty. The Kennedys were wealthy, powerful, political, but Jack, he was different. He was sickly as a boy, thin, often pale. His back hurt. His stomach turned. His body even then seemed to resist him, but his eyes were bright, sharp, curious, always watching. He was a boy who loved to read. History, adventure, war. Books that took him far from his sickbed and into worlds where courage could be found not in muscles but in mind. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was a man of ambition, a businessman, a politician, a voice that filled every room. He expected greatness from his children, especially from his oldest son. Joe Jr. Jack was the second son, the one people worried about. But he listened, he learned, and quietly, he took it all in. He went to private schools, always a little behind in health, but never in spirit. He joked often, he smiled easily, he charmed without trying, and even when illness kept him down, he came back again and again. At Harvard, he studied history and government, and though his father's shadow loomed long, Jack slowly stepped out of it. He wrote papers that challenged assumptions. He debated with professors. He thought about war, about why nations rose and fell. And even then, even quietly, he dreamed of leadership. But then came World War II. Joe Jr. enlisted first. The Golden Sun. Jack followed. Despite his fragile health, he joined the Navy, and in the South Pacific, aboard a small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, Jack Kennedy faced the first great trial of his life. His boat was struck by a Japanese destroyer in the middle of the night. The explosion split the vessel in half. Sailors were thrown into the sea. Darkness swallowed everything, but Jack, injured, bleeding, exhausted, swam for hours, towing a wounded crewman by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth. They swam to an island, then another. Surviving on rainwater and coconuts, he led them, not because he was the strongest, but because he refused to give up. When they were finally rescued, the story reached back home. For the first time, John F. Kennedy was known not just as Joe's brother, but as a hero in his own right. Still, war has its shadows. Jack returned with pain in his back that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and not long after, Joe Jr. was killed in a mission over Europe. The Golden Sun, gone. The future of the Kennedy legacy had to shift. Now it turned to Jack. He did not leap toward politics, but the path came for him all the same. He ran for Congress in 1946, young, handsome, soft-spoken. People were drawn to him, not just for his name, but for his grace. He listened, he smiled, and he won. Washington noticed. This wasn't the loud, boastful kind of politician. This was something quieter, sharper, warmer. A man who understood pain, but didn't show it. A man who knew loss, but still believed in hope. Night after the speeches were done, he would return to his study. Read, write, think. He published a book, Profiles in Courage, about U.S. senators who stood up for principle even when it cost them dearly. And in those pages, a quiet truth appeared. Jack Kennedy didn't just want to serve, he wanted to inspire. He wanted Americans to believe in the best version of themselves. And though his body still ached, though doctors warned him often that he was not strong, he kept going. He ran for Senate in 1952, and again, he won. By now, the country had begun to fall in love with him, his charm, his youth, his wife, Jacqueline, poised and elegant. Together, they looked like the future. But even as crowds grew, as cameras flashed, Jack remained soft-spoken, deliberate, measured. He knew that every step forward brought more weight, more expectation, and, deep down, he began to feel it. The presidency. He didn't say it. Not yet. But the idea lived in him, like a quiet flame, waiting, before the motorcades. Before the speeches that echoed across a nation, before the tragedy remembered by generations, he was just Jack. Born on May 29, 1917, in a large white house on a quiet street in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the second child in a family that would one day be called American royalty. The Kennedys were wealthy, powerful, political, but Jack and he was different. He was sickly as a boy, thin, often pale. His back hurt. His stomach turned. His body even then seemed to resist him, but his eyes were bright, sharp, curious, always watching. He was a boy who loved to read history, adventure, war, books that took him far from his sickbed and into worlds where courage could be found, not in muscles but in mind. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was a man of ambition, a businessman, a politician, a voice that filled every room. He expected greatness from his children, especially from his oldest son, Joe Jr. Jack was the second son, the one people worried about. But he listened, he learned, and quietly, he took it all in. He went to private schools, always a little behind in health but never in spirit. He joked often. He smiled easily. He charmed without trying, and even when illness kept him down, he came back again and again. At Harvard, he studied history and government, and though his father's shadow loomed long, Jack slowly stepped out of it. He wrote papers that challenged assumptions. He debated with professors. He thought about war, about why nations rose and fell, and even then, even quietly, he dreamed of leadership. But then came World War II. Joe Jr. enlisted first. The Golden Sun. Jack followed. Despite his fragile health, he joined the Navy, and in the South Pacific aboard a small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, Jack Kennedy faced the first great trial of his life. His boat was struck by a Japanese destroyer. In the middle of the night, the explosion split the vessel in half. Sailors were thrown into the sea. Darkness swallowed everything. But Jack, injured, bleeding, exhausted, swam for hours, towing a wounded crewman by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth. They swam to an island, then another, surviving on rainwater and coconuts. He led them not because he was the strongest, but because he refused to give up. When they were finally rescued, the story reached back home. For the first time, John F. Kennedy was known not just as Joe's brother, but as a hero in his own right. Still, war has its shadows. Jack returned with pain in his back that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And not long after, Joe Jr. was killed in a mission over Europe. The Golden Sun gone. The future of the Kennedy legacy had to shift. Now, it turned to Jack. He did not leap toward politics, but the path came for him all the same. He ran for Congress in 1946, young, handsome, soft-spoken. People were drawn to him, not just for his name, but for his grace. He listened, he smiled, and he won, Washington noticed. This wasn't the loud, boastful kind of politician. This was something quieter, sharper, warmer. A man who understood pain but didn't show it. A man who knew loss but still believed in hope. At night, after the speeches were done, he would return to his study. Read, write, think. He published a book, Profiles in Courage, about U.S. senators who stood up for principle even when it cost them dearly. And in those pages, a quiet truth appeared. Jack Kennedy didn't just want to serve, he wanted to inspire. He wanted Americans to believe in the best version of themselves. And though his body still ached, though doctors warned him often that he was not strong, he kept going. He ran for Senate in 1952, and again, he won. By now, the country had begun to fall in love with him, his charm, his youth, his wife, Jacqueline, poised and elegant. Together, they looked like the future. But even as crowds grew, as cameras flashed, Jack remained soft-spoken, deliberate, measured. He knew that every step forward brought more weight, more expectation, and, deep down, he began to feel it. The presidency. He didn't say it. Not yet. But the idea lived in him, like a quiet flame, waiting. Before the motorcades, before the speeches that echoed across a nation, before the tragedy remembered by generations, he was just Jack, born on May 29, 1917, in a large white house on a quiet street in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was the second child in a family that would one day be called American royalty. The Kennedys were wealthy, powerful, political. But Jack, he was different. He was sickly as a boy, thin, often pale. His back hurt. His stomach turned. His body even then seemed to resist him, but his eyes were bright, sharp, curious, always watching. He was a boy who loved to read, history, adventure, war, books that took him far from his sickbed and into worlds where courage could be found, not in muscles but in mind. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was a man of ambition, a businessman, a politician, a voice that filled every room. He expected greatness from his children, especially from his oldest son, Joe Jr. Jack was the second son, the one people worried about, but he listened, he learned, and quietly, he took it all in. He went to private schools, always a little behind in health but never in spirit. He joked often, he smiled easily, he charmed without trying, and even when illness kept him down, he came back again and again. At Harvard, he studied history and government, and though his father's shadow loomed long, Jack slowly stepped out of it. He wrote papers that challenged assumptions. He debated with professors. He thought about war, about why nations rose and fell, and even then, even quietly, he dreamed of leadership. But then came World War II. Joe Jr. enlisted first, the Golden Son. Jack followed. Despite his fragile health, he joined the Navy, and in the South Pacific, aboard a small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, Jack Kennedy faced the first great trial of his life. His boat was struck by a Japanese destroyer. In the middle of the night, the explosion split the vessel in half. Sailors were thrown into the sea. Darkness swallowed everything, but Jack, injured, bleeding, exhausted, swam for hours, towing a wounded crewman by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth. They swam to an island, then another, surviving on rainwater and coconuts. He led them, not because he was the strongest, but because he refused to give up. When they were finally rescued, the story reached back home. For the first time, John F. Kennedy was known not just as Joe's brother, but as a hero in his own right. Still, war has its shadows. Jack returned with pain in his back that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and not long after, Joe Jr. was killed in a mission over Europe. The Golden Son, gone. The future of the Kennedy legacy had to shift. Now, it turned to Jack. He did not leap toward politics, but the path came for him all the same. He ran for Congress in 1946, young, handsome, soft-spoken. People were drawn to him, not just for his name, but for his grace. He listened, he smiled, and One Washington noticed, this wasn't the loud, boastful kind of politician. This was something quieter, sharper, warmer. A man who understood pain but didn't show it. A man who knew loss but still believed in hope. At night, after the speeches were done, he would return to his study, read, write, think. He published a book, Profiles in Courage, about U.S. senators who stood up for principle even when it cost them dearly. And in those pages, a quiet truth appeared. Jack Kennedy didn't just want to serve, he wanted to inspire. He wanted Americans to believe in the best version of themselves. And though his body still ached, though doctors warned him often that he was not strong, he kept going. He ran for Senate in 1952, and again he won. By now the country had begun to fall in love with him, his charm. His youth, his wife, Jacqueline, poised and elegant. Together they looked like the future. But even as crowds grew, as cameras flashed, Jack remained soft-spoken, deliberate, measured. He knew that every step forward brought more weight, more expectation, and, deep down, he began to feel it, the presidency. He didn't say it, not yet, but the idea lived in him, like a quiet flame, waiting as just Jack. Born on May 29, 1917, in a large white house on a quiet street in Brookline, Massachusetts, he was the second child in a family that would one day be called American royalty. The Kennedys were wealthy, powerful, political. But Jack, he was different. He was sickly as a boy, thin, often pale. His back hurt. His stomach turned. His body even then seemed to resist him. But his eyes were bright, sharp, curious, always watching. He was a boy who loved to read, history, adventure, war, books that took him far from his sickbed and into worlds where courage could be found, not in muscles, but in mind. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was a man of ambition, a businessman, a politician, a voice that filled every room. He expected greatness from his children, especially from his oldest son, Joe Jr. Jack was the second son, the one people worried about, but he listened, he learned, and quietly, he took it all in. He went to private schools, always a little behind in health but never in spirit. He joked often, he smiled easily. He charmed without trying, and even when illness kept him down, he came back again and again. At Harvard, he studied history and government, and though his father's shadow loomed long, Jack slowly stepped out of it. He wrote papers that challenged assumptions. He debated with professors. He thought about war, about why nations rose and fell, and even then, even quietly, he dreamed of leadership. But then came World War II. Joe Jr. enlisted first. The Golden Sun. Jack followed. Despite his fragile health, he joined the Navy, and in the South Pacific, aboard a small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, Jack Kennedy faced the first great trial of his life. His boat was struck by a Japanese destroyer. In the middle of the night, the explosion split the vessel in half. Sailors were thrown into the sea. Darkness swallowed everything, but Jack, injured, bleeding, exhausted, swam for hours, towing a wounded crewman by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth. They swam to an island, then another, surviving on rainwater and coconuts. He led them, not because he was the strongest, but because he refused to give up. When they were finally rescued, the story reached back home. For the first time, John F. Kennedy was known not just as Joe's brother, but as a hero in his own right. Still, war has its shadows. Jack returned with pain in his back that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and not long after, Joe Jr. was killed in a mission over Europe. The Golden Sun, gone. The future of the Kennedy legacy had to shift. Now, it turned to Jack. He did not leap toward politics, but the path came for him all the same. He ran for Congress in 1946, young, handsome, soft-spoken. People were drawn to him, not just for his name, but for his grace. He listened, he smiled, and One Washington noticed, this wasn't the loud, boastful kind of politician. This was something quieter, sharper, warmer. A man who understood pain but didn't show it. A man who knew loss but still believed in hope. At night, after the speeches were done, he would return to his study, read, write, think. He published a book, Profiles in Courage, about U.S. senators who stood up for principle even when it cost them dearly. And in those pages, a quiet truth appeared. Jack Kennedy didn't just want to serve, he wanted to inspire. He wanted Americans to believe in the best version of themselves. And though his body still ached, though doctors warned him often that he was not strong, he kept going. He ran for Senate in 1952, and again he won. By now the country had begun to fall in love with him, his charm, his youth, his wife, Jacqueline, poised and elegant. Together, they looked like the future. But even as crowds grew, as cameras flashed, Jack remained soft-spoken, deliberate, measured. He knew that every step forward brought more weight, more expectation, and deep down, he began to feel it. The presidency. He didn't say it, not yet. But the idea lived in him like a quiet flame, waiting. The stage was set. By 1959, whispers had become questions. Questions had become headlines. Could John F. Kennedy be the next president of the United States? He was still young, just in his early 40s. Too young, some said. Too Catholic, others warned. No Catholic had ever been elected president. But Jack had something more powerful than experience. He had presence. He didn't shout. He didn't boast. He simply showed up. And wherever he did, people gathered. Not just because of who he was, but because of how he made them feel. He made them feel like America could begin again. That it could still be bold, still courageous, still beautifully unfinished. In 1960, he declared his candidacy. The race was long, grueling, but it reached a turning point in an unusual place: television. In the first ever televised presidential debate, John F. Kennedy stood beside Vice President Richard Nixon. Nixon was sharp, experienced, knowledgeable, but Kennedy was calm, poised, clear. He spoke slowly, directly, like someone who wasn't trying to impress, but trying to connect. Millions watched, and for many, it was the first time a candidate felt like someone they knew. When the votes were counted in November 1960, the margin was razor thin. But John F. Kennedy had won. At just 43 years old, he became the youngest elected president in U.S. history. He didn't come from a battlefield of generals. He didn't rise from a southern plantation or Midwestern farm. He came from a place of vision, of hope. And in January 1961, on a cold, snowy morning in Washington, D.C., he stood before the nation and delivered his inaugural address. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The words didn't just echo, they moved. They carved themselves into the hearts of a generation. This was not a leader who promised ease. He promised purpose. He spoke of defending freedom, of seeking peace, of lifting those in poverty, advancing science and embracing a new frontier, space. And when he spoke, he made the future sound possible. He filled the White House with young energy. Reporters called it Camelot, a nickname that stuck. Jack and Jackie, elegant, bright, youthful. They represented not what the country had been, but what it could still become. But even as the lights of the cameras flickered, dark clouds gathered just off screen. The Cold War was real. The threat of nuclear destruction lived in quiet corners. And only a few months into his presidency, JFK faced a crisis in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro. The plan had been handed to him by military advisors. But when it failed, Kennedy took responsibility. He didn't blame others, he didn't hide, he simply said, "Victory has 100 fathers, and defeat is an orphan." It hurt, it humbled him, but it also sharpened him. He learned that real leadership wasn't about avoiding mistakes, it was about owning them, and he moved forward. Each night after the meetings ended and the rooms fell quiet, JFK often walked the halls of the White House alone. His back ached. The pain never left him. He wore a brace beneath his suits, sat upright through force, not comfort. But he never complained. He read, he thought, and he prepared, because he knew the world would test him again. And it would. But for now, in that first year, he lit a match in the hearts of the American people. Belief that democracy was not old and tired, but young and still growing, still worth fighting for. And as he closed his eyes each night in the quiet of the Lincoln bedroom, beneath the same roof where greatness had once walked, he did not dream of power, he dreamed of progress and hoped that history was listening. The world grew quieter in October of 1962, but not in peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. In back rooms and war rooms, papers were passed, brows were furrowed, and maps were studied with trembling fingers. Because on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores, the Soviet Union had begun placing nuclear missiles, weapons that, if launched, could reach American cities in minutes. And for a moment, just a breath in time, the world stood closer to nuclear war than it ever had before, or ever would again. President John F. Kennedy sat in a chair in the Oval Office, calm on the outside. Inside, he was calculating, measuring, waiting. He didn't want war, but he would not accept a threat so close. He gathered his closest advisors. They debated airstrikes, invasion, diplomacy. Time was slipping. Every day the missiles in Cuba came closer to operational, and the American public, they didn't know. Not at first. But behind closed doors, decisions were being made that could end millions of lives. Kennedy listened. He let the loudest voices speak, but when he finally raised his own, it was measured, clear, firm. He chose not to bomb, not to invade. He chose a naval blockade, a line in the water. Ships would stop Soviet vessels from bringing more missiles into Cuba. And then he went on television. In a calm, even voice, he told the American people what was happening. He didn't use fear. He didn't spread panic. He spoke to them like adults, like citizens. And the country held its breath. Across the ocean, Soviet ships approached the blockade line. Cameras watched. Leaders paced. Fingers hovered over buttons that should never be pressed. And then, the ships stopped. Behind the scenes, secret messages passed between Moscow and Washington. Kennedy offered a deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The US would promise not to invade. And quietly, American missiles in Turkey would also be removed later. It was diplomacy, but also nerve. And it worked. The crisis ended. No bombs fell. No lives were lost. The world, by a thread, had pulled itself back from the edge, and in that moment John F. Kennedy was not just the President of the United States. He was a guardian of peace. He had stared into the darkest possibility and chosen restraint, not weakness, not fear, restraint. A lesson he had learned early, on boats in wartime, in hospitals, in pain, that survival does not always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from stillness. The world exhaled, and in the quiet that followed, Kennedy turned his eyes upward, not just to clouds, but to stars, because he believed that mankind should reach further than fear. He gave a speech that summer at Rice University. Under the open sky, he said, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." He wasn't just talking about space. He was talking about belief, about effort, about the American spirit. That restless, beautiful idea that we can be better than we are. He pushed for civil rights, spoke of equality, called for new laws to protect the dignity of black Americans. The path was not easy. He faced resistance, even in his own party. But he walked forward, step by step, because he believed that the presidency wasn't just about leading those who already agreed. It was about moving a country forward, even when it pulled back. At night, he still walked the halls of the White House. His back stiff, his eyes tired, but always, always his mind alive. He had dreams, not for power, but for peace, not for comfort, but for courage. And slowly, the nation began to believe again, to imagine, to hope. But just as the light grew brighter, a shadow began to form. Something quiet, unseen, waiting just ahead. But for now, Jack Kennedy stood in the stillness of the West Wing, hands in his pockets, and looked at the stars through the window. Not for answers, just for the reminder that we are small, but capable of great things. It was November in Texas. The skies were clear, the sun soft on stone buildings. Crowds gathered in the streets, waving flags, holding small children on their shoulders, smiling as the motorcade passed by. John F. Kennedy sat beside his wife in the back seat of a sleek, open-top car. He smiled, waved, leaned toward the people, as if trying to touch each moment with his presence. The city of Dallas had never seen a reception so warm. It was meant to be just another day, a public appearance, a speech at the Trade Mart, a reminder that the president saw the people, not from a distance but face to face. But fate had other plans. As the motorcade turned down Elm Street, everything changed. 3 sharp cracks cut through the cheers, echoes, off-stone confusion at first, then screams. In an instant, the man who had carried the hopes of a generation slumped forward. His head rested gently on Jackie's shoulder. The car sped away. No sirens at first, just panic. A nation, stunned. At Parkland Memorial Hospital, doctors rushed, but there was nothing left to do. At 1 p.m. on November 22, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was pronounced dead. The news spread not with noise, but with silence. People stopped in grocery store aisles. Teachers turned away from chalkboards. Radios went still. Then slowly, trembling voices repeated what no one wanted to say aloud. The president is gone. Flags were lowered, faces buried in hands. Phones rang endlessly as families reached for someone, anyone, to hold the moment together. It wasn't just grief, it was disbelief. How could someone so young, so full of promise, vanish in a moment? At Air Force One, as the plane sat still on the runway, Lyndon B. Johnson stood solemnly beside Jackie Kennedy, her pink dress stained with the day's horror. He placed his hand on a small black Bible, took the oath, and the presidency changed hands in silence, but hearts did not move on so quickly. For days the country mourned together. People lit candles in windows, children wrote letters, strangers wept on each other's shoulders. The funeral procession rolled through Washington, slow and reverent. A horse-drawn caisson carried Kennedy's flag-draped coffin. Black horses, white gloves, the sound of drums echoing down Pennsylvania Avenue. Jackie walked behind her husband, holding the hands of their children. John Jr., just 3 years old, gave a small, solemn salute. The image would echo across the world, so small, so pure, so heartbreakingly final. They buried him at Arlington National Cemetery, beneath a stone carved simply with his name and the dates that held his story. And just above the grave, they lit an eternal flame. It still burns, not to honor a man of power, but to remember a man of vision. In the quiet after the storm, the nation asked, "What now? Where do we go from here?" His speeches were replayed, his words reread. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. He had served less than 3 years, but in that time he had reminded the world what grace looked like, what it meant to speak gently but stand firmly, to suffer quietly, to lead thoughtfully. He never lived to see the moon landing he had called for. He never saw the Civil Rights Act he pushed begin to take shape. But his light, brief as it was, lit the path ahead. And in every gentle step the country took forward, in every dream spoken aloud, he was there, still whispering from beyond the echo. That hope is worth the wait. That beauty can live inside tragedy. That even a short life can change history. Some legacies take generations to form, others just a few years. But John F. Kennedy's legacy, it arrived the moment silence fell after his final breath, not in marble statues, not in long laws or detailed records, but in the feeling he left behind, a feeling that America could be better, smarter, kinder, braver. He did not live to see the moon landing, but when Neil Armstrong placed his foot on lunar soil, he spoke words inspired by Kennedy's call. 1. A small step for man. And though the president had been gone for nearly 6 years, everyone knew the dream had begun with him. He did not sign the Civil Rights Act. That came under Lyndon Johnson. But the courage to speak plainly about race, to call it a moral crisis on national television, that came from Jack. He once said, "If we cannot now end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity." And those words live on in classrooms, in courtrooms, in quiet conversations where justice tries to rise. He didn't end the Cold War, but he helped the world step back, to look, to breathe, and to understand that even in a world split by ideology, there must always be space for peace, for diplomacy, for decency. When people speak of Kennedy now, they speak not just of policies, they speak of possibility. They remember a man who walked with pain, but stood with ease. A man who spoke with gentleness but carried enormous weight. A man who reminded the world that leadership is not measured in how long you serve, but how deeply you inspire. Jacqueline Kennedy, years after his death, gave the nation a gift. She told a reporter that Jack had loved the Broadway musical Camelot, about King Arthur's legendary court, and she quoted its closing lines. "Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot, for one brief shining moment. That was Camelot." She wasn't speaking of kings, she was speaking of him, that brief moment, when hope stood tall in the sun, wearing a smile, riding in an open car, waving toward a future he believed could still be shaped. And though he was taken too soon, the fire never went out. It lives, in the dreams of those who still believe in courage, in justice, in a quiet kind of greatness, in the soft rhythm of progress, and in that eternal flame flickering gently over his grave, a reminder that some lights, once lit, never truly fade. They simply become part of us. Before he stood on battlefields, before he crossed icy rivers or signed his name into the first pages of a new nation, he was simply George. Born on February 22, 1732, in the colony of Virginia, in a world ruled not by presidents, but by kings, world into which he arrived was quiet. Tobacco fields, gentle rivers, dirt paths that stretched between small towns and large plantations, and in the distance, the endless trees of the American wilderness. He was the eldest child of his father's second marriage, one of many brothers and sisters, raised in a home where land meant security and honor meant everything. His father, Augustine Washington, was a planter, a man of status but not of great wealth. He died when George was just 11, and from that moment, a quiet seriousness took hold of the boy. He never went to college. His education was modest, taught in small rooms with few books. But he learned what mattered most: math, geography, manners, and how to read people. Even young, he stood tall, straight-backed, observant. Still, people said George Washington didn't speak unless he needed to. And when he did, you listened. He wasn't yet great, but he carried himself like someone who might be. As a teenager, he learned the art of surveying, measuring land, mapping borders, navigating dense woods with little more than a compass, and his wits. He moved through wilderness most men feared. It taught him patience, discipline, and respect for the wild unpredictability of the land. And always, there was that quiet fire inside him, not a hunger for fame, but a belief that duty mattered. He watched from afar as his older half-brother Lawrence married into the powerful Fairfax family. And through that connection, George met Virginia's elite. He wasn't born into the highest ranks, but he stood there, tall, composed, calm, and belonged. When Lawrence died of illness, George inherited the Mount Vernon estate, a quiet stretch of land by the Potomac River. Rolling hills, grand trees, and slow, soft evenings filled with the sounds of crickets and waterbirds. It became his home. But peace would not last. Conflict brewed in the far reaches of the colonies. Tensions between Britain and France over territory in North America began to rise. George, now in his early 20s, volunteered. He joined the Virginia militia and was sent on a mission to deliver a message to the French deep in the Ohio Valley. He rode through snow, crossed icy rivers, faced ambushes and near death. And when he returned, though the mission had failed, he was admired for his bravery. Not yet a general, not yet a leader of a revolution, just a young man. Quiet, tall, thoughtful, but already learning that the world could turn quickly. That loyalty could stretch thin, that nations could be built or broken by choices made in silence. In the years that followed, he would serve in the French and Indian War. He learned how to lead, how to listen, how to lose, and how to hold his ground when everything around him crumbled. But when the war ended, he returned to Mount Vernon. He didn't seek more war, he sought home. There he married Martha Custis, a widow, wealthy and wise, with 2 young children. George became not just a husband but a stepfather. He tended to his farm, managed crops. Read by candlelight, he was respected across Virginia, called to serve in public office, looked to for advice. But still, he stayed quiet, until the winds began to change, until the distant crown in London began reaching too far, taxing too much. Treating colonists as less than equal citizens, whispers turned to conversations, conversations turned to debates, and slowly, that quiet fire inside George Washington began to rise again. He didn't yell, he didn't scheme, he simply stepped forward, and once again, the world would begin to follow. The fires of revolution did not begin with muskets or drums. They began with paper, with voices, with quiet resistance. Across the colonies, people gathered in taverns and town squares. They spoke in low tones about freedom, taxes, and a distant king who seemed to know nothing of their daily lives. And in those meetings, those letters, those debates, one name began to rise, not loudly but steadily: George Washington. He wasn't the most eloquent speaker. He wasn't the loudest patriot, but he had something rarer: trust. Men listened when he stood. They followed when he nodded. They believed in the way he carried himself, and so in 1775, as tensions reached a breaking point, as British troops marched and colonial militias readied muskets, the Continental Congress turned to Washington. They asked him to lead the newly formed Continental Army. He didn't ask for it. He didn't campaign for it, but he accepted, not with a roar but with a solemn nod. He wore a plain blue uniform. He refused a salary. He said simply, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." And yet, he was. From that moment, Washington became more than a man. He became a symbol of steadiness, of sacrifice, of unity in a time of division. The army he inherited was not an army in the traditional sense. It was a patchwork of farmers and blacksmiths, school teachers, and boys. They had little training, few supplies, and no guarantee they would survive. But Washington did not lead with fear. He led with presence. He rode among his men, a tall figure on horseback, silent often but always watching. They camped in mud, marched through snow, slept without blankets. Many wanted to give up, but when they looked at Washington, standing in frost, unmoved, steady, they stayed. In 1776, as hope began to dim, Washington made his boldest move. On Christmas night, while most armies would rest, he led his men across the icy Delaware River. Rain fell, ice cracked. Men slipped, but they rode forward, teeth clenched, cold biting their skin. They marched through the dark, and at Trenton they surprised the enemy, securing a small but vital victory. It did not end the war, but it reminded the nation that resistance was still alive. The war would drag on. For years. Battles won, battles lost. Letters sent home from bloodied camps. Winter at Valley Forge, where hunger gnawed and illness spread. But through it all, Washington never abandoned his men. He wrote letters by candlelight. He pleaded with Congress for boots, for food, for medicine. And still, he stood, sometimes silent, always present. The British called him a rebel. His men called him general, but quietly, across the fields of a war-torn land. A new word began to form behind his name. Leader. He refused to accept personal glory. He never took more than he needed. And when his officers suggested seizing power to restore order, he refused, because Washington did not fight for control. He fought for something softer, harder to define: liberty, dignity, the right of a people to choose their own path. And finally, in 1781, after years of blood and frost and aching sacrifice, victory came. At Yorktown, the British surrendered. The war was over. Cheers rang out, tears fell. The dream of an independent America was now real. And Washington, he sheathed his sword, mounted his horse, and quietly returned home. No throne, no crown, just the fields of Mount Vernon and the sound of leaves in the wind. He had led a revolution and asked for nothing in return. And in that gesture, he became not just the father of a nation, but the soul of it. After the war, the world expected George Washington to reach for power. That's what most generals did. They won the sword and kept it, took the crown, named themselves rulers for life. But Washington did something almost unimaginable. He stepped back. He retired to Mount Vernon to walk among his trees, to tend his fields, to write letters by firelight, to finally be still. But the country he helped create was not still. The young United States, free now but uncertain, began to shake. The Articles of Confederation were weak. States argued, trade faltered. There were whispers of division, and again the people looked to him. They asked him to return, to help guide a new constitution, a stronger framework for a more perfect union. He presided over the Constitutional Convention, not as a voice shouting over others, but as a steady presence, reminding the room what was at stake. And when the new government was formed, when the people were asked who should lead this fragile newborn country, there was only one answer: George Washington. He was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States, not a king, not a conqueror, just a man, chosen by the people, to serve the people. He took the oath of office in 1789 on a balcony in New York City. He placed his hand on the Bible, and in a voice strong but humble, he swore to protect the Constitution. There were no parades with golden carriages, no coronation robes, just simple words and a heart full of duty. The presidency had never existed before. There were no instructions, no roadmap. So Washington did what he always had. He led with principle. He chose advisors, men of differing views. He listened more than he spoke. He debated carefully, signed laws cautiously, and always remembered the people who had sent him there. He didn't belong to a political party. He warned against division. He believed unity was delicate, something that had to be nurtured, not forced. During his presidency, the country began to stand on its own feet. The economy grew. New states joined the Union. The capital moved to a stretch of land that would one day bear his name, Washington, D.C. But even as the nation grew, so did the weight on his shoulders. Every decision felt historic. Every disagreement personal. He was not ruling over a kingdom. He was helping shape a republic. He served one term, then a second, and when people asked him to stay for a third, he said no, because power was never his goal. His goal was something quieter, to prove that a leader could leave. That democracy meant more than elections. It meant trust. He stepped down, voluntarily, peacefully, and in doing so, he gave the world an example it had never seen, a man who held power and then let it go. He gave a farewell address, a letter really, not shouted, not dramatic, just honest. He warned against hatred between political factions. He warned against permanent foreign alliances. He urged Americans to stay united, to be cautious and to believe in their common future. Then he returned home, not to a throne, but to a farmhouse, to the quiet hum of Mount Vernon, to birdsong in the morning, and stars in the still Virginia. Sky. He had led a war. He had shaped a nation. He had defined a presidency. And now he would rest, not because his work was forgotten, but because it had become the country itself. Mount Vernon had waited patiently. Through war, revolution, and 8 years of presidency, the home on the hill had stood quietly, nestled along the Potomac River. And now, in 1797, George Washington returned, not as general, not as president, but simply as George. He rose early each day, tended to his estate, walked among the trees, watched the river flow steadily past, unchanged, unhurried. The world outside buzzed with politics, new presidents, new disputes, new voices rising in the republic he had helped create. But Washington remained distant from it all, not out of pride, but because he believed his time had passed and the future now belonged to others. He had done enough, and yet he never truly stopped caring. He read newspapers by candlelight, wrote letters to friends and former advisors, watched carefully as his successor, John Adams, took up the presidency. He did not seek the spotlight. He welcomed visitors, yes, farmers, neighbors, dignitaries, but only for a while. Then he would retreat to quiet, because peace had always been his deepest wish. His body had begun to slow. Years of riding, war, stress, and illness had left their mark, but his mind remained sharp. He walked each evening at sunset, watched the sky turn from blue to rose to soft gray, spoke little, thought much, and in those silent moments it's easy to imagine what he remembered: the frozen night at Valley Forge, the first oath on that New York balcony, the sound of cannons over Yorktown, the gentle laughter of Martha in their shared parlor. Time moved slowly now. He had no regrets, only memories, only gratitude. And then came December of 1799. Cold rain fell across the estate. Washington went out to ride, as he always did. The wet wind cut through his coat. He returned chilled but said nothing. That evening he dined with guests, laughed softly, shared stories. But overnight, the cough began, the soreness in his throat, the tightness in his chest. By morning, it was worse, doctors were called. They tried the methods of the day, bloodletting, mixtures, steam, but nothing helped. And slowly, steadily, the breath began to leave him. He did not panic. He gave quiet instructions. He thanked those at his side. He asked not to be buried until 3 days had passed. He wished to be sure. And then, in the stillness of a cold winter evening, on December 14, 1799, George Washington passed away. He was 67 years old. News traveled slowly. But when it reached the cities, church bells tolled for hours. Businesses closed. People wept in the streets. A nation mourned. not because they had lost a king, but because they had lost something rarer, a man who had held power and given it back, a man who had been offered glory and chosen humility. They buried him at Mount Vernon beneath a simple tomb, no grand cathedral, no towering monument, just a man, laid to rest beside the river he loved, the river that still runs gently even now. Visitors still come to stand in the quiet, to read the name on the stone, to feel even just for a moment what it means to live a life in service to something greater than self. And in that stillness, you might just hear it, the rustle of leaves, the wind off the water, the soft echo of a promise kept. He could have been king. When the war was won and the British ships sailed away, some whispered it, others said it aloud. Make Washington a monarch, give him a crown, let him rule forever. It had happened before, in other lands. When men won wars, they often kept the sword in one hand and seized power with the other. But George Washington said no. He did not fight to replace one ruler with another. He fought to give people the chance to rule themselves, and so he walked away. First from the army, then later from the presidency. That choice, quiet, simple but extraordinary, became the foundation of American democracy, because true greatness isn't proven by how long one holds power. It's proven by how gently one lets it go. When people today speak of him, they often use the phrase, the father of his country. But he never asked for that title, never demanded loyalty, never used the presidency for gain or control. He served, and then he stepped back, so the people could step forward. He wasn't perfect. He lived in a time of contradiction. He owned slaves even as he spoke of liberty. He struggled with decisions, made mistakes, felt doubt. But what made him great was not the absence of fault. It was the presence of reflection, of duty, of the quiet, steady belief that the future could be better, if built not on force but on faith in the people. That belief shaped everything that followed. When presidents take the oath today, they stand beneath his portrait. When citizens gather, protest, vote, build, they do it in a nation he helped shape. He was the first, and in many ways he remains the model, not because he sought glory, but because he trusted the idea that the people should be free. And when his time came, he didn't hold on, he let go. That perhaps is the greatest legacy, not a battle, not a speech, not even a signature, but the image of a tall, quiet man riding home, while a new nation stood upright behind him. When you think of America's first president, don't picture marble or parades. Picture a man standing by a river, the sky turning gold at dusk, his hands behind his back, thinking not of himself, but of what might come next. That is George Washington, and his story, even now, still reminds us that leadership doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply walks away with grace. Before the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, before the presidency, before the long letters, the eloquent speeches, or the founding of a university, he was simply Thomas. Born on April 13, 1743, in the green hills of Virginia, in a world still ruled by England, and yet already dreaming of freedom, he was born into comfort. A large family on a plantation called Shadwell, surrounded by books, fields, and a view of the Blue Ridge Mountains. From the start, he was quiet, not shy, just thoughtful. He listened more than he spoke. He watched the way the wind moved through trees. He copied down Latin phrases by candlelight. He learned music, architecture, languages. By age 9, he was reading the classics, Homer, Cicero. Virgil books, for him, weren't just education. They were companions, a way to understand the world through the minds of those who had come before. He would go on to study at the College of William and Mary, where professors noticed him quickly. A tall boy, slender, with red hair and a distant look in his eye, as if always pondering something just out of reach. He didn't speak often in class, but when he did, everyone listened. He studied law, not for argument but for reason. He believed that words, well placed, could shape ideas into something solid, something lasting. He returned to Virginia to begin practicing law, but he always kept to the shadows of politics until the colonies began to tremble. New taxes, new orders from England, new whispers of discontent. Jefferson didn't rise in anger. He rose in clarity. When others shouted in taverns, he wrote. When others called for resistance, he asked, "What should we become instead?" He was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, then later to the Continental Congress. There his quiet nature stood out. He did not dominate the room, but when they asked who might write a declaration, a statement for the world to read, a document to explain why the colonies would break from Britain, they turned to him. At just 33 years old, he took up his pen. In a small rented room in Philadelphia, with a violin nearby and stacks of books at his elbow, he wrote and rewrote and refined. And when he was finished, he had written one of the most powerful sentences in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The words were not perfect. They did not erase the contradictions of the time. He himself was a slaveholder, a man born into privilege, a dreamer living within the very system he hoped to challenge, but still. The words rang out, louder than muskets, stronger than protest, and in them a vision of a country not yet formed but imagined. He would go on to serve as governor of Virginia, then as minister to France, then Secretary of State under George Washington. But no matter how far he traveled, he always dreamed of home, a place on a mountaintop, a house he designed himself, with columns and domes and wide-open windows, a place called Monticello. It was not just a house, it was a reflection of his mind, balanced, curious, open to the sky. He filled it with books, instruments, maps, inventions. He rose with the sun, read for hours, wrote letters long into the evening. He believed in knowledge as nourishment, and in rest as a kind of respect, a way to honor the mind and body for what they carry. In those early years, long before the White House, long before history painted him into its portraits, he was simply a man with a pen and a purpose, and the belief that ideas can shape a nation. The pen had always been Thomas Jefferson's weapon of choice. While others led armies or filled chambers with speeches, he shaped his thoughts in ink, carefully, precisely, like an architect drawing a foundation before the stones are ever set. And slowly, that pen carried him toward the highest office in the land. After his years abroad, studying, observing, learning in France, he returned to a new country. The United States of America was no longer a dream. It was real, and real things are messy. There were debates, power struggles, disagreements over how this new nation should be run. Jefferson believed in the power of the people. He feared too much government, too many kings in disguise, so he founded a new political party, the Democratic Republicans, not to dominate, but to balance. He believed freedom must be protected, even from those with good intentions. He served as Secretary of State under George Washington, then later as Vice President under John Adams. And when the election of 1800 came, it was more than a contest. It was a battle of visions. Jefferson wanted a more rural, independent, citizen-led country. Adams believed in stronger federal control. It was bitter, it was loud, but when the votes were finally counted and the dust settled, Thomas Jefferson was elected the third president of the United States. And just like that, the first peaceful transfer of power between political rivals occurred. No swords, no violence, just ballots. Jefferson walked to his inauguration on foot. No carriage, no pomp. He gave a speech not of triumph, but of healing. He said, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," because he understood that unity didn't mean agreement. It meant remembering what held them together. During his presidency, he made choices that would shape the country's future forever. In 1803, he approved the Louisiana Purchase. For $15 million, the U.S. doubled in size. Vast stretches of land, rivers, mountains, and possibilities. He sent Lewis and Clark to explore this new frontier, to draw maps, meet native tribes, touch the Pacific Ocean. And from Monticello, Jefferson followed their progress like a father waiting for a letter from home. But with every expansion came questions about land, about power, about slavery. He wrote of freedom, but lived among contradiction. He owned slaves, more than 100. And though he expressed discomfort, even opposition in writing, he never freed them all. This is part of his truth. He was a man who dreamed beyond his time, but still lived within it. He walked between enlightenment and silence, between brilliance and blindness, and yet he worked tirelessly to build. Reduced the national debt. He championed religious freedom. He refused to be treated like a monarch. He reminded the young republic that government exists to serve, not to rule. After 2 terms, he stepped down. No parade, no fanfare, just a quiet return to Monticello, back to his books, his gardens, his letters, back to the peaceful rhythm of hills and seasons. He believed his public service was done, but his mind, his restless, searching mind, still had work to do. He had already helped build a country. Now he would help shape its soul. When Thomas Jefferson left the presidency in 1809, he returned to Monticello with no desire for applause. He had no interest in titles, ceremonies, or statues. What he had always wanted was quiet, time to think, time to write, time to let his thoughts settle like soft dust across the pages of history. He rose early. He walked the grounds of his plantation, inspecting the gardens, studying the sky, tending to his books and his beloved architecture. Every room in Monticello had a purpose. Every hallway was filled with ideas, maps, inventions, fossils, clocks. He was a man of curiosity, even in old age, and above all else, he wrote thousands of letters to friends, to scientists, to politicians, to former enemies. But one name appeared again and again: John Adams, the same John Adams he had once fiercely opposed, the man he had defeated in the bitter election of 1800. The old friend turned rival, and yet as time softened the edges of their youth, they returned to one another, not with politics, but with understanding. Their letters flowed with wit, wisdom, and reflection. They wrote of books, of family, of the nation they had helped build. They wrote of mortality, too. Both of them knew their time was drawing near, but they did not fear it. They had lived long enough to see their fragile experiment endure. A country, still young, but standing. Jefferson's thoughts also turned to education. He believed deeply that democracy could not survive without an informed citizenry, and so in his final years he helped found the University of Virginia, not just a place for the elite, but for anyone willing to learn. He designed the buildings himself, chose the books, guided the curriculum. He said, "This institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind." That was his gift, not just what he had done during his lifetime, but what he hoped would outlive him. He wanted the future to be filled with thinkers, questioners, citizens who challenged the world, not blindly followed it. And though his body weakened, his mind remained awake. He wore spectacles, moved more slowly, felt the aches of age, but his pen never paused. His beliefs never dimmed. And then, as summer rose over Virginia in 1826, he fell ill. The air grew thick, his breathing shallow, but he remained calm. He asked about his debts, his books, the university, Monticello, and then, softly, he asked, "Is it the 4th?" It was, July 4th, 1826, 50 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, 50 years since his pen had given birth to a nation's voice. And on that day, in the quiet of Monticello, Thomas Jefferson passed away. Just hours later, far away in Massachusetts, John Adams, unaware of his friend's death, whispered his final words: "Thomas Jefferson survives." And in a way he did, because Jefferson had never needed statues. His legacy lived in ideas, in the belief that people should be free, that truth should be pursued, that education, not power, was the path forward, and in every classroom, every library, every place where freedom is taught with care, his voice remains, not loud, not perfect, but present. Monticello stood quiet. The house on the hill, with its white dome and wide brick walkways, overlooked a soft green valley that rolled toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. It had always been Jefferson's sanctuary, his retreat, his laboratory of thought, and now, after his passing, it remained, full of echoes. Every room held a piece of him: his books, lined neatly on custom-built rotating shelves. His inventions, gadgets to record weather, to map distances, to double-write letters, his collections of art and maps, busts of philosophers and thinkers. Monticello wasn't grand in the way of European palaces. It wasn't meant to be. It was a place of intention, a house built not to impress but to reflect. It faced the morning sun. Its walls were filled with learning. Its gardens were carefully designed to grow what nourished the body and the mind, and in its quiet corners, Thomas Jefferson had shaped not just architecture, but ideals. After his death, visitors came. Some came in reverence, some in curiosity, some in silence, unsure of what to feel. Because Jefferson's legacy, like the man himself, was layered, he wrote the words that inspired revolutions. All men are created equal. But he also held hundreds of men and women in bondage. At Monticello, enslaved people worked the fields, built the structures, served the meals. He knew it. He struggled with it. He spoke against slavery as an institution, but he never freed most of the people he owned. Among them was Sally Hemings, a woman of mixed race, long believed, and now widely accepted, to have borne several of Jefferson's children. He never publicly acknowledged her. Their story is part of his story. It cannot be erased, nor should it be, because understanding Jefferson means holding both truths in the same hand, that he dreamed boldly, and failed to rise fully to his own dream. And yet, his belief in liberty and learning and the human mind's potential still inspires. He once wrote, "I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past." He knew that perfection was unreachable, but progress was not. He believed in trying, and even now, long after his footsteps left the halls of Monticello, even as shadows stretch across its garden paths, there is something there, a presence. Reflection of the man who stood at the edge of a nation's beginning and dared to give it words, not as commandments, but as a promise, to do better, to try harder, to grow, even in conflict. Monticello is now a museum. People visit from around the world. They walk the gravel paths. They peer into his writing room. They read plaques that tell both his brilliance and his failures, and in that honesty, he is remembered fully, not as a saint, not as a villain, but as a man who meant well, even when he did not always do well. And perhaps that's where legacy truly lives, in complexity, in the way we hold admiration and accountability together, in the way we continue the work he could not finish. And as the sun sets behind Monticello, bathing the home in amber light, there's a stillness, a feeling that the past is not behind us but beside us, guiding gently, asking us to write the next chapter with clearer eyes. It began as a draft, a few pages of parchment, words chosen carefully, crossed out, rewritten, again and again by candlelight, and yet those words, written by Thomas Jefferson at just 33, have outlived nations, outlasted war, traveled across oceans, and settled deep into the heart of what it means to dream of freedom. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That sentence became more than ink. It became memory, hope, a standard to be reached even when the path is long and uncertain. Jefferson never imagined the words would be perfect forever. He believed in revision, in the progress of thought. He saw America not as a finished project, but as an ongoing experiment. He called the Declaration his instrument, and for the rest of his life he watched as others picked it up. Some used it to fight tyranny. Some used it to demand rights denied. Some carried it into courtrooms, protest lines, classrooms, parliaments. It spoke not just for a single moment in 1776, but for any moment when justice feels just out of reach. Jefferson never saw what would come of it. He did not see the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, the World Wars, the marches and rulings and reckonings still to unfold, but he trusted deeply that the power of an idea could move more than armies ever could. He said, "Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind." He understood that a document could not hold a nation together, but a principle could. He chose his final words to history carefully. On the gravestone at Monticello, he listed not his presidency, not his time as governor or diplomat, Only these three: author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Statute for Religious Freedom in Virginia, founder of the University of Virginia, because those were the things he believed would live on, and they have. More than 2 centuries later, his words still greet visitors to museums. They are printed in textbooks, etched into monuments, whispered in quiet moments of courage, not because he was flawless, but because he captured something timeless: vision. A belief that people are born with dignity, that governments must serve the governed, that the arc of a nation must be shaped by the minds and hearts of its people. Tonight, as you rest, know that his dream still walks beside us, not finished, but unfolding, not perfect, but persistent, because every generation gets to pick up the pen and keep writing that original promise, in our own way, with better eyes and kinder hands. And somewheres in the quiet corners of Monticello, where the wind brushes gently across old brick and the trees lean in with memory, you can almost hear it, the soft turning of a page, the whisper of a sentence that still matters, the echo of a man who believed in light not for himself, but for those who would come after. Long before the Rough Rider, long before the White House, before the glasses, the mustache, the booming speeches, he was simply TD. Born on October 27, 1858, in a brownstone in New York City, Theodore Roosevelt was a sickly child. Asthma gripped him in the night. He gasped for breath while others played. Thin and often pale, he watched the world from windows, his body weak, but his spirit restless. He read everything: books about nature, war, animals, history, faraway lands. He kept journals filled with facts, sketches, questions. When he couldn't run with the other boys, he explored with his mind, but he didn't want to stay sick. So one day he told his father, "I will make my body." And he did. He took to lifting weights, boxing, hiking, riding. He climbed mountains, rode across lakes, braved storms. Even as his lungs struggled, he refused to stay still, because stillness to him wasn't rest. It was surrender. His father, Theodore Sr., was his hero, a generous man, warm, wise. He once took young TD on a grand tour of Europe, showed him castles, cities, museums, but more importantly, he showed him that privilege carries responsibility. The Roosevelt family was wealthy, yes, but TD was taught that the strong must protect the weak. That justice wasn't just a word, it was a duty. And when his father died suddenly in 1878, TD was shattered. He wrote in his journal, "The light has gone out of my life." But grief did not freeze him. It moved him. He threw himself into his studies at Harvard, studied history, politics, natural science. He still had asthma, he still wore thick glasses, but inside he burned brighter than ever. He spoke quickly, moved quickly, thought quickly, and though not everyone liked him, no one could ignore him. He married Alice Lee, a bright, beautiful woman with a kind smile. He adored her. They moved into a small home, started a quiet, happy life. And then, on Valentine's Day, 1884, just hours after giving birth to their first daughter, Alice, his wife died. And in the same house, on the same day, his mother passed away too. He wrote a single X in his diary, and under it the words, "The light has gone out of my life." Again, he left everything, fled to the Dakota Territory, to the wide, harsh, lonely plains of the West. There he rode horses, hunted buffalo, braved winters that numbed the soul. He lived as a cowboy, a gentleman turned frontiersman, letting the silence of the prairies stitch his heart back together. And it worked. Nature healed him. Hardship hardened him. And when he returned east, he returned changed, taller in spirit, sharper in purpose. He was no longer just TD. He was Theodore Roosevelt. And the world was just beginning to notice. Theodore Roosevelt returned from the wild with a fire in his eyes. Not the fire of anger, but of conviction. He had tested himself in the wind and snow of the Dakotas, and now he was ready to test himself in something just as wild: politics. He began in the New York State Assembly, young, energetic, and unshakably confident. He wore thick spectacles and spoke like a man chasing a thought faster than most could follow. Some mocked him, but many listened. He fought corruption, demanded reform, pushed past the whispers of "he's too young" or "too bold." Because Roosevelt didn't believe in waiting, he believed in doing. After losing his wife and mother, he had learned a painful lesson: that life was fragile, short, and not meant to be wasted. He took that urgency with him everywhere. Over time, he held many roles: police commissioner of New York City, assistant secretary of the Navy, and in each he stirred things up. He patrolled the city streets in the middle of the night, rooted out corruption, demanded justice where others looked away. And when the Spanish-American War erupted in 1898, he didn't stay behind a desk. He resigned his post, formed the Rough Riders, and went to Cuba. There, in the heat and chaos of battle, he led the charge. Up San Juan Hill, not from the back, from the front. His bravery was reckless, some said, but others called it unforgettable. He returned home a hero, not just in headlines, but in the hearts of Americans who admired his fearlessness. Soon after, he was elected governor of New York, but his reforms unsettled the party bosses. So they did what they thought would remove him from real power. They nominated him as vice president under William McKinley. It was, they thought, a quiet role, but fate had other plans. In September 1901, President McKinley was shot, and just like that, the 42-year-old Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history. He stepped into the role not with hesitation, but with energy. He brought life back to the White House. Children played in its halls. He held meetings while walking through the gardens. He boxed, he hiked. He read a book a day, but he also worked hard. He believed the president should be a steward for the people. He challenged monopolies, stood up to railroad barons, pushed for fairness, not just freedom. He called it the square deal, a promise that every American, rich or poor, deserved a fair shot. He regulated industries, fought for workers, protected consumers, and when businessmen resisted, he smiled with those fierce, shining teeth and pressed forward anyway. But perhaps his greatest love was the land itself. Long before he became president, before the medals and speeches, Theodore Roosevelt had fallen in love with the wild. It wasn't just scenery to him, it was something sacred. As a boy, he studied birds with binoculars from his window. As a young man, he roamed the Badlands on horseback, sleeping beneath the stars, listening to the wind tell stories through the trees. So when he became president, he didn't forget those stars, or the silence of untouched woods, or the cry of eagles circling above red rock canyons. He remembered, and he protected them. Roosevelt became the first true conservation president. He created 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and over 150 national forests. In total, he preserved over 230 million acres of American wilderness. He didn't do it for prestige. He did it because he believed the land belonged to everyone. To the child in the city who had never seen a mountain, to the farmer who worked the same soil his grandfather had plowed, to the generations still to come. He said, "The nation behaves well if it treats its natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired." He loved Yellowstone. He stood at the rim of the Grand Canyon and urged Congress to leave it untouched. He explored Yosemite with John Muir, sleeping under the open sky and waking to the sound of waterfalls. But his fight to preserve wasn't easy. Businessmen called him foolish. Politicians pushed back. But Roosevelt never backed down from a worthy fight. He used a law called the Antiquities Act, and with a stroke of his pen, he transformed landscapes into legacies. And still, he worked. He hosted children at the White House, read thousands of letters a year, took reporters on hikes, and spoke to crowds with boundless enthusiasm. He wasn't just strong in body, he was strong in belief. He believed that the presidency wasn't a throne. It was a bully pulpit, a platform to speak for those who had no voice. And so he spoke for the forests, for the animals, for the future. Even today, when you walk through a quiet trail in a national park or stand at the edge of a canyon untouched by time, you are walking with him. The man who saw the soul of a nation in its rivers and roots and knew that some things must be left wild to remain worthy. Even after 2 terms as president, even after changing laws, reshaping landscapes, and facing down the fiercest industries, Theodore Roosevelt could not rest. He wasn't built for quiet. He left the presidency in 1909, handing it over to his chosen successor, William Howard Taft. He planned to write, to explore, to step away. But the fire inside him wouldn't dim. He traveled to Africa, led a grand expedition through the savannas and jungles, studying animals, collecting specimens for the Smithsonian. He slept in tents, tracked lions, wrote his thoughts by lantern glow. But when he returned to America, he found the world changed. He disagreed with how President Taft had governed. He felt the reforms he fought for were slipping, and so, despite his earlier promise to step back, Roosevelt did the unthinkable. He ran for president again, this time as the leader of a brand new party, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. When asked if he was strong enough to campaign, he smiled and said, "I'm as strong as a bull moose." The crowds cheered. Children waved flags with moose drawings. And Roosevelt, now older, more weathered, but still full of energy, toured the country with passion in his voice and dust on his boots. But the election of 1912 was complicated. Roosevelt split the vote with Taft, and the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, won. It was a loss. But Roosevelt didn't see it that way. He had spoken his truth. He had given people a choice. He had reminded the country that one man, with courage, could shake the system, and still, he would not sit still. In 1913, he did something most former presidents would never dream of. He went to South America to explore an uncharted river in the Amazon, the River of Doubt. Dense jungle, poisonous insects, disease, unmapped terrain. But Roosevelt went anyway. It nearly killed him. He became sick, gravely so. He had a leg injury, high fever, tropical infection. At times he whispered that they should leave him behind, but his companions refused, and slowly, painfully, he recovered. They completed the expedition, mapped the river, returned home with stories of piranhas, rapids, and survival. His body never fully healed, but his spirit unbroken. He returned to writing, to speaking, to watching his sons grow, young men now with the same restless blood. As war began to rise again in Europe, he offered to serve. He was denied, his health too frail. But he urged America to stand strong, to be brave, to believe in its values. He had seen too much of life to believe it could be tamed, and in every breath he reminded others to live boldly. Because for Theodore Roosevelt, there was no greater tragedy than to live cautiously. He once said, "It is not the critic who counts, and the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena." And he had lived every word. The final years of Theodore Roosevelt's life came quietly, but not easily. He had lived more in 6 decades than most would in 10. His body bore the proof: wounds from battle, illness from jungles, scars both, seen and unseen. But even as his strength faded, he remained fierce in spirit. He continued to write books, essays, letters to editors, to friends, to fellow patriots. He spoke about courage, about character, about duty. He believed deeply that greatness did not come from titles, but from how a person lived when no one was watching. As World War I engulfed Europe, he urged America to stand firm, to fight for justice, not empire. 4 of his sons volunteered to serve. His beloved Quentin, the youngest, was killed in combat, shot down in France. It broke Roosevelt's heart. He never fully recovered. They said he cried alone, late at night, in silence. But still, he stood tall in daylight, for his country, for his family, for the belief that sacrifice meant something. In his final months, he moved more slowly, read more, wrote with less fire, but no less clarity. He still rose early, watched the light stretch across his estate at Sagamore Hill, where the wind smelled of pine, and the porch creaked gently under his step. He was no longer the charging rough rider, but in his eyes you could still see the boy who refused to break, the cowboy who refused to quit. the leader who refused to lead from behind. And then, on January 6, 1919, he passed away in his sleep, peacefully, in the home he loved, surrounded by the land and silence that had always called to him. He was 60 years old. News spread quickly. One newspaper wrote simply, "Death had to take him in his sleep, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight." But there was no fight left to win. Theodore Roosevelt had already given everything, his energy, his courage, his voice, his belief that America must never grow lazy or small in spirit. That boldness, even in failure, was better than quiet success. He left behind a country stronger than when he found it, wilder, more protected, more conscious of its place in the world, and even today his echo remains. In every protected forest, every child who dreams bigger than their limits, every citizen who steps forward when others stand still. Because Roosevelt showed us something rare, that a man can be strong and kind, fierce and fair, loud and thoughtful. He wasn't perfect, but he was present, fully alive, fully committed, fully unafraid to face what others avoided. He once said, "Far better it is to dare mighty things than to rank with those timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." And that's the legacy he left behind. A call, not to sit quietly on the sidelines, but to step boldly into life, to try, to fail, to try again, and when the time comes to rest, to do so with no regrets, just the wind through the trees, the quiet of the hills, and the comfort of knowing you lived with a Rough Rider's heart,